there, and welcome to the channel. I'm Cassidy Cash, and this is the place where we talk about history, specifically what was going on between 1564 and 1616, the life of William Shakespeare. I love to show you where history is reflected in Shakespeare's plays, and we spend a lot of time talking about games, recipes, crafts, and facts from the 16th and 17th century. If that all sounds like your cup of tea, or maybe your mug of mead, or your jug of ale, well, then hit that like and subscribe button because I'm here every week with even more history. In Shakespeare's lifetime, agriculture was a major foundation of commerce and infrastructure for the English economy. Iris in the Tempest lists off many of the crops that were popular in Shakespeare's lifetime, saying wheat, rye, barley, vetches, oats, and peas. Because of the popularity of bread and beer and the continued consumption of vegetables known as peas, I bet you are probably already familiar with everything on that list except maybe vetches. I know that when I read this, that was a new grain for me as well. I had never heard of a vetch or what that might be. So if you're like me and curious to find out what a vetch is, how it was eaten, and where did it grow, well, stick around because that's what's new right now on That Shakespeare Life. I had to look this up completely from scratch because I had never heard of this plant and I didn't know what it was. So, other than, I assumed it was a plant because it's listed along with wheat and barley, and I know those are plants. So, okay, it's a plant, but what does it do? I didn't know. If you didn't either, here's what I found out. Vetches are indeed a plant. They are a small green flowering plant. It's actually part of the legume family. So they are in the same category as beans or lentils. In fact, there's a lot of varieties of vetches like bird vetch, American vetch, and common vetch. And there's even one whose name I bet you will recognize called a broad bean. That is actually a type of vetch. And there's even other kinds too. Vetches often grow different kinds of flowers, and the one in this picture looks kind of like a small, tiny snapdragon to me, the way that it grows. But if you're into farming, you may already know this about vetches, but they are a nitrogen fixing plant that works well as a cover crop for farming systems. And what that means is when you plant your primary crop, that's going to take nutrients out of the soil, nitrogen, out of the soil to grow them. And so now the soil is depleted. Well, if you plant vetch as your follow up crop, then you are putting nitrogen back into the soil because that's what vetches are good at. So farmers would use vetches this way, even in Shakespeare's lifetime. As far as how they were eaten, apparently way back in the 12th century, there was a monk named Bernard of Clairvaux who actually made a bread that included bitter vetch as one of the ingredients. The only written record we have of this was another monk who had eaten it, writes that it was so miserable to consume that he actually took a piece of it back to his hometown because he didn't think they would believe him on his word alone when he described how the people at this monastery were living and the just disgusting nature of what they were eating. That's how bad it tasted. So you can see why it was called bitter vetch. Blah. In the history of planting vetches, the bitter vetch was sometimes eaten by people, but it did taste really bad, just like the monks discovered when old Bernard tried to give it to them. So it was generally only consumed when there was literally nothing else to eat. There are records of people growing it and eating it in times of starvation or when they were extremely poor and didn't have any other options. Now, broad beans are, I mentioned, a specific kind of vetch, and they taste much better. And historical record shows that some civilizations, like the Hittites and the Amorites and even the Egyptians, were eating broad beans over 3,000 years ago. And some of these beans are even mentioned in the Bible. But I don't think broad beans made it to England until much later. I saw some records by C.R.J. Curie. He wrote an article in 1988 titled Early Vetches in Medieval England, a Note. In that, he says that there's archaeological evidence placing vetch as being grown in Kent, England, as early as the 13th century. Though his article doesn't detail whether that was being grown for animal fodder or if what was happening to the crop after they grew it. So there's not a record, at least not in that article, of what they were doing with it. I get the impression that people were not so much consuming common vetch. It was listed as a field crop, which means I think farmers were using it strictly to enrich their soils. But if you've ever met a farmer, they're not going to spend the time and energy growing a crop, even of vetch, and then not make money on that crop. So I'm pretty sure even back in the 16th century, that vetch crop was being sold on as something. I think my best guess is that it was being sold on as food for horses or cows. And I think that because there's another article also from 1988 written by a man named Bruce Campbell, which I guess 1988 was just a good year to write about vetches, but he writes about vetch in his article, and his article is more about the economy around the agriculture of using horses, and that's where his discussion of vetch comes up. So his work implies that vetch was actually grown, so basically they're growing horse feed. So you might think of something like alfalfa today, I think, is a decent comparison because it is primarily an animal crop today, at least here in the US, although people do sometimes consume it also for various health benefits. So I think that's where vetch falls, but irregardless, there are many, many varieties of vetch, and some of them are specifically grown to feed cattle or horses, and other varieties are actually known to be toxic to humans. The reference to vetches in Shakespeare's play The Tempest not only distinguishes between vetches and peas, so it looks like they're not describing vetches as a wild pea, which Wild Food UK does list vetches as a wild pea that you can harvest or forage for human consumption. So some of the vetches would be used for that, but Shakespeare's reference seems to be listing off cash crops, or what if you were a professional farmer growing food, this is a list of some of the profitable farming crops. And Shakespeare's reference, at least in The Tempest, isn't necessarily an indication that all the grains listed would have been eaten by people. This concept is further backed up by the British Agricultural Society. I found an article on their website about crop rotation in East Worcestershire from 1540 to 1660. That article lists vetches as a popular crop along with wheat, barley, and oats, and it's almost exactly like the list from The Tempest. So I think the Tempest record is, in fact, a list of what would be profitable if you're trying to grow things. And because I know you wanted to go this deep into the history of vetch, I'll also share that the Agricultural and Horticultural Development Board in the UK made a map showing the distribution of common vetch in the UK and Ireland. And the vetch, you can see all the little green sections there are where that it grows. So it's everywhere pretty predominantly, except there are huge sections of Ireland where it does not grow. So it seems that vetch was used for a variety of things, and what your crop was going to go on to be sold as probably depended entirely on which version of vetch that you decided to grow. If you were growing broad beans, you'd probably sell that for people. If you were growing one of the other, I think it's called Vicia, and it has a Latin name I'm not going to butcher here for you. But if you're growing some of the others, like bitter vetch that people wouldn't want to eat, you'd sell that on for your cows or horses. So what you're going to sell it for probably depended on which one you grew. But going into that and trying to figure out exactly what was most common for the 16th century would take way more time than I had for this episode. So today I'm just sharing with you that it was a kind of bean. People could eat it, and it was also served to cows and horses. That's it for this week. Thank you for watching. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.